Hello everyone, I'm Riya Gandhi and welcome back to my channel. I'm back again with yet another video adding to our post-colonial theory series that we have been covering for the past few weeks. In our previous videos, we explored Edward Said's Orientalism, where we saw how the West constructed the East through stereotypes and imagination. Then we moved on and we talked about Homi K. Bhabha, who taught us about hybridity, mimicry, and the third space, the in-between zone where cultures and identities mix and resist colonial authority. And now, after having discussed Edward Said and Homi K. Bhabha, let's complete the holy trinity of post-colonial theory, and that is Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. In this video, we are going to talk about Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, whose work sort of shifts the focus from representation and hybridity, the concepts that we have been talking about for the past few weeks. And instead, she talks about voice, she talks about power, and the politics of speaking for the oppressed, right? So in today's video, we are definitely going to understand her intellectual influences, and of course, we are going to discuss her most famous essay, which is Can the Subaltern Speak? An essay that remains seminal in post-colonial theory series. It's been a part of the academic curriculum for a lot of universities, and definitely it is asked in UGC NET English exam repetitively. So make sure you stick around till the end of this video and don't forget to make notes. Speaking about Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, how can one describe her? How can one introduce her? She often described herself as a practical Marxist, feminist, deconstructionist. Sounds too heavy, right? But it actually isn't. What it really means is that she has tried to combine Marxism's concern for class and power, how Marxists believe that power relations in society are based on class and the divisions of class in the society. She tried to combine that with the feminism's cause for equality, for gender and gender-based equality. And she also tried to talk about Derrida's concept of deconstruction. When we are talking about Derrida's concept of deconstruction, it basically is a philosophical approach in which he has critiqued, or he has tried to do away with the traditional notions of language, wherein we often feel that the word and its meaning, they have a very fixed relationship. But Derrida's concept of deconstruction sort of moved away from all of these things, and he believed that meaning is something that is very fluid. Meaning is something that is very, very, very unstable, right? So she tried to combine a little bit of Marxism, a little bit of feminism, and a little bit of deconstruction. And as a result of which, she called herself as a practical Marxist, feminist, deconstructionist. In addition to sort of also describing herself as a deconstructionist, it is very interesting to note that Spivak's career sort of also began, that she rose to prominence with her translation of Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology in 1967. Right? A translation that sort of has become a very, very groundbreaking work today. In addition to translating Derrida, Spivak also translated the works of Shweta Devi, one of India's most powerful voices, especially when you're talking about women writers, to talk about the tribal and the marginalized lives in India. So all in all, when we are talking about Spivak, we need to understand that her commitment was not just to theory, right? It was also to practice. And not just that, she gave space to voices from the margins. And that is why when we are talking about her place in postcolonial theory or her contribution to postcolonial theory, to the development of postcolonial theory, we need to understand that she did not just talk about representation. She did not talk about cultures or hybridity or all of those things. Rather, she talked about how in the post-colonial setting, in the post-colonial context, how people from the marginalized communities, how do they deal with their everyday life? How do their voices, or how or when and if their voices are being heard or not? So if Edward Said examined how the West represents the East, and if Homi Bhabha explored the in-between spaces, right, where identities mix, cultures mix, Spivak asks something more fundamental in the post-colonial setting. She asks, who gets to speak in the first place? And when they do, are they truly being heard or merely spoken for? So when we are talking about Spivak, we need to understand that her concern was more with the orality of it, whether you get to tell your story or not, right? So she became associated with the Subaltern Studies group, which is a collective of Indian historians who wanted to write history from below, right? So focusing on peasants, workers, laborers, women, and other marginalized communities who were ignored by the mainstream colonial and national histories. Taking their ideas even further, you have Spivak, who said that sometimes even the well-educated, well-meaning intellectuals who can speak properly, who can debate, who can carry on these political debates and always march for speaking for a cause, sometimes even they reproduce the same kind of silencing that they are trying to undo, right? So, which basically means that sometimes these well-educated and well-meaning intellectuals also try to silence the voices of the marginalized communities that they were speaking for in the first place. And that is why she published her most influential essay, which is Can the Subaltern Speak? So when we are talking about Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, it was first published in 1988. It is considered to be one of the most important essays in cultural theory, right? It is very dense, it is challenging, and it is tough. So let's simplify it together, shall we? First, let us understand what does the term subaltern mean. So the term actually comes from an Italian Marxist called as Antonio Gramsci. The term subaltern refers to the groups in society who are socially, geographically, politically outside the mainstream power structure, right? Or the mainstream structures of power. Basically, those who have no voice or representation in the structures of power. Someone who is not taken into consideration for the socio-cultural or their political rights. So in the context of India, you have the subaltern could represent peasants, the tribal people, women, right? People from the backward classes, right? So when Spivak asks, can the subaltern speak? She's not asking whether they can literally speak or not. She's asking, can they be heard, right? Can their voices exist in systems that are designed to ignore or erase them? Which basically means that in a system which is structured, which is created in a way that only gives privilege or that only provides that spotlight on the elite, the privileged classes of society. In that system, will their voices be heard? That is the crux of this entire essay. Now let's break down Spivak's main argument step by step. We already know that she was influenced by the Marxist theory. So she begins by critiquing the Western intellectuals. Who were these Western intellectuals? Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, who claimed that the oppressed have their own voice, or the oppressed can represent themselves, that they already have a voice. Spivak says, not really, right? So even when the subaltern tries to speak, according to her, their speech is sort of filtered. Their speech is translated and it's often reinterpreted through the dominant structures, right? So their voices are being filtered through the dominant structures. What are these dominant structures? Academia, media, politics. So in other words, the subaltern's voice, according to Spivak, doesn't reach us as it is. It's always mediated by others. So let us understand this with the help of an example. When a rural woman in India protests for land rights, right, her story is often told by journalists, NGOs, politicians, people who have access to public platforms. Her actual voice, her lived experience, that sort of like often disappears in translation, right? So this was a very basic example, but that's just to showcase how the voices are being filtered, right? So that's what Spivak meant when she said the subaltern cannot speak. It's not about the literal act of speaking, right? It's more about their own voice, right? And how their own voice is filtered through the lens of media, academia, culture, politics, etc. So it's not that they don't have a language. It's that their speech doesn't always register within the dominant system. So to illustrate her argument even further, Spivak sort of examined the colonial as well as the nationalistic discourses about sati, around the sati pratha, right? The practice where a Hindu widow was expected to sort of immolate herself, that is, burn herself on her husband's funeral pyre. Now, we all know the history, right? The colonial authorities, especially the British, they sort of condemned the sati as barbaric and using it as a proof that Indians needed to be civilized, right? But notice what's missing. Nowhere in these debates do you hear the women's own voice. The entire discussion, white men saving brown men from brown men, as Spivak famously put it, becomes a debate around her or about her, never by her, right? So the subaltern woman, as Spivak observes, is doubly silenced, right? First by patriarchy and second by colonialism. And that is why I think her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, draws a very, very important intersection between gender and colonial discourses. Spivak concludes that even acts that seem like resistance are often not recognized as such, because the frameworks of recognition, how do you recognize this person? How do you introduce the person? How do you define the person? All of these things are controlled by the dominant groups, right? So as a result of which, I've always believed that her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, is a very seminal one because it draws an important correlation between gender and colonial discourses, which was something that neither side nor Baba covered in their works. Now, despite being a significant contributor to postcolonial theory, being a part of the Holy Trinity in the postcolonial discourse, Spivak often sort of had an uneasy relationship with postcolonial theory. In fact, in her book, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, she argued that even post-colonial theory somewhere is producing the colonial patterns. It is reproducing the colonial patterns by only privileging, by only providing importance to certain voices, to certain languages and frameworks. This is what she has called as sanctioned ignorance, wherein certain institutions or societies just sort of intentionally, deliberately ignore or dismiss certain contexts as irrelevant. For example, when Western feminism talks about global women's empowerment, but rarely have they included the voices of women from rural India or Africa, right? This is what Spivak has called as sanctioned ignorance. Now, having said that, not everyone agrees with Spivak, and not everyone agrees with Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? Some critics argue that by saying that the subaltern cannot speak, she, according to them, is sort of reinforcing their silence, which means that she is also silencing them, making it sound like they don't have an agency. Like, how can you say that the subaltern cannot speak at all? Right? And then there are others who also point out that her language is too dense, that she is too theoretical, she is inaccessible to the very people that she is talking about, right? But then you also have her defenders who say that Spivak's complexity is required because she's talking about intricate situations, she's talking about complex discourses, the politics of representation, power and speech, and all of these things are never really that simple, right? They are going to be complex and they are going to be intricate up to a certain extent, right? Definitely over the period of time, you also have Spivak clearing the air. She clarified that her essay was meant not to declare that the subaltern will never speak, but to remind us that we must question who gets to represent whom and on what terms, right? So this is something that I think I've repeatedly emphasized throughout this video, that when we are talking about Spivak's concept of representation, especially in her essay Can the Subaltern Speak, it's all about who gets to represent whom, when, why and what terms, right? In that process, who is silenced, who gets to silence them, and when, right? So if you're asking why does Spivak matter, especially for students of literature, culture and post-colonial theory, you need to understand that she forces us to question our position as readers, researchers, educators, professors, etc. So to sum it all up, if Edward Said exposed how the West constructed the East and Homi Bhabha showed how colonized people, they sort of disrupt essentialist identities that we harbored about culture and community, right, through mimicry and hybridity, then Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak asks the most important question of all, which is, what happens to those who aren't even seen or heard in this conversation, right? So again, the same question, who is silenced, who gets to silence them, and when? So when we are talking about her essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, it's not just important from UGC NET perspective. Yes, definitely you need to prepare that for your exam, but it is also there to remind us that silence of the marginalized is not natural. It's something that is produced, right? It's created by a system that only privileges the elite or the privileged classes of society. So as a student of literature or as aspiring professors, educators, I think our job is to not just speak and raise our voice for the subaltern. It's also to create a space for them so that they can represent themselves more openly. Don't you think? Please let me know in the comments section below. So this was about Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. If you found this video informative and helpful for your UGC NET English exam, then please like, share and subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for the next video in our post-colonial theory series. Thank you so much for watching till the end, guys. I'll see you in the next one.